Somewhere right now, you are probably thinking about work. A deadline, a shift, an inbox. Whatever it is, there's a decent chance it's sitting somewhere in the back of your mind even right this second, quietly humming underneath whatever else you're doing. For almost the entirety of human existence, that specific kind of pressure didn't exist at all. Not because life was easier necessarily, and not because ancient people had nothing to worry about, because the entire concept of a job, a fixed schedule, a boss, a wage, a clock you clock in and out of, hadn't been invented yet. There was no separate category called work waiting at the other end of a commute, ready to swallow a set portion of the day the moment you arrived. So what did people actually do with an entire day, every day, for hundreds of thousands of years before any of that existed? In 1966, a group of anthropologists gathered in Chicago for a symposium called Man the Hunter, and one answer, based on new fieldwork, seemed to settle the question completely, at least for a while. It was electric, and it landed hard, because it flipped a very old assumption on its head, one that had gone essentially unchallenged for centuries. Most people at the time, scholars included, assumed prehistoric life was a desperate, exhausting scramble for survival. Every waking hour spent one bad week away from starvation, brutal and short, exactly the way old philosophy textbooks described it. The new fieldwork suggested something almost embarrassing by comparison, something that made industrial civilization look less like progress and more like a strange detour. It suggested our ancestors had it better than we do. The centerpiece of the new fieldwork was research by anthropologist Richard Lee, who had spent time living among the Jew/Hoansi, sometimes called the Kung, in the Kalahari Desert of southern Africa, one of the harshest environments anthropologists could imagine choosing to study. Lee tracked, hour by hour, exactly how many hours they spent hunting and gathering food. His number was strikingly low, something like 2 to 4 hours a day, in a landscape most outsiders assumed would demand constant, grinding effort just to stay alive. Anthropologist Marshall Sahlins took that data, combined it with similar findings from Aboriginal groups studied extensively in Arnhem Land, Australia, and in 1972 published a book making a bold, almost provocative claim. He called it the original affluent society, a deliberately ironic label for people most of the world still pictured as impoverished. Hunter-gatherers, he argued, worked roughly 15 to 20 hours a week and spent the rest of their time however they liked, unburdened by the endless wanting that defines modern consumer life. Sahlins even cited an even more extreme estimate for the Hadza of Tanzania, less than 2 hours a day on average across an entire year, hunting and gathering included. Compared to a standard 40-hour work week, this looked less like survival and more like an early retirement nobody had told the rest of us about. The idea spread everywhere, well beyond academic anthropology, into economics, into popular books, into the way ordinary people talked about progress and modern life. Our ancestors, it turned out, were working bankers' hours, tens of thousands of years before there were bankers, before there was money, before there was anything resembling a bank. Here's the twist almost nobody mentions when they repeat that statistic. Lee's own complete numbers told a very different story if you kept reading past the headline figure everyone quoted afterward. His original count only measured time spent directly hunting and gathering, out in the bush, actively pursuing food. It left out food processing, which, as with many staple foods, could be substantial. It left out cooking. It left out collecting firewood, repairing tools, and building or maintaining shelter, all of which anthropologists would call work by any reasonable definition. When Lee added all of that back in, when he counted the entire chain of labor from finding food to actually being able to eat it, actual total working time came out to about 44.5 hours a week for men and 40.1 hours a week for women. That's not less than a modern work week. That's more. The 15-hour figure that made Sahlins famous wasn't fabricated exactly. It was just measuring a much narrower slice of the day than most people assumed when they heard the number, and it quietly left out everything that wasn't hunting or gathering with your own two hands out in the open. And there's a second, deeper problem. one that's only become fully clear in hindsight, decades after the theory took hold in the popular imagination. Sahlins built his entire theory on data from essentially two groups, studied for less than a month each, and neither population was untouched by the outside world by the time anthropologists arrived to observe them. It was, by later standards, a remarkably thin foundation for a claim that reshaped how millions of people thought about the deep human past. When later researchers expanded the dataset dramatically, tracking dozens of different hunter-gatherer societies across wildly different environments and climates instead of relying on just two, the average came out to something like 40 to 45 working hours a week, practically identical to the number most people clock in at their own job today, give or take a few hours either way. So the popular version of this story, ancient humans barely worked at all, mostly doesn't hold up. But that raises a much more interesting question than the one we started with. If the hours were roughly the same, what actually made an ancient day so different from a modern one? The answer isn't how much time people spent working, it's how that time was organized. And organized is almost the wrong word, because that's precisely what's missing. There was no clock dividing the day into labor and leisure, no single employer, no fixed shift that started and ended at the same time, regardless of how anyone felt or what the weather was doing that particular morning. A single day might include tracking an animal for hours across open ground, then abruptly switching to repairing a broken tool, then processing whatever food had been gathered that morning. A task that, as anthropologists studying societies like the Tukanoan cassava processors have documented in other contexts, can itself consume hours of steady, repetitive labor with no obvious start or endpoint. Then minding a child, or several, then resting because the midday heat made anything else genuinely pointless, not lazy, just physically sensible. Then a slow, unhurried return to camp as the light changed color, with no supervisor checking whether the day had been productive enough, and no sense that the hours spent resting somehow didn't count. Nobody clocked in, nobody clocked out. The tasks blurred into each other and into the rest of life so completely that most hunter-gatherer languages, according to researchers who have studied them closely, don't even have a clean, separate word for work the way English does, a single, tidy category walled off from everything else a person does. There was simply the stuff that needed doing, some of it urgent, some of it social, some of it almost indistinguishable from rest or play, all mixed together across a day that had no fixed start time, no fixed end, and no moment where a bell rang to tell anyone which category they were currently in. That distinction, a job as a bounded, scheduled, externally assigned block of time separate from the rest of your life, is startlingly recent when measured against the full span of human existence. It didn't really exist until agriculture created stored surplus, grain that could sit in a container for months rather than needing to be eaten within days, and surplus created, for the first time, the conditions for some people to control the labor of others. Specialization followed, because a surplus meant not everyone had to spend their day producing food anymore. Then, hierarchy, because someone had to decide who worked on what and who kept the surplus. Then, eventually, over thousands of further years, wages, shifts, punch clocks, and the modern idea that a specific, measured portion of your day belongs on a strict and externally enforced schedule to someone else entirely. Which means the version of work most people live with today, the version that follows you home in your head at the end of the day and greets you again before your alarm even finishes ringing, is a genuinely new invention, layered on top of a much older, messier, all-day rhythm of activity that never had a name for itself because it never needed one. For most of the time humans have existed, there was simply no moment in the day when you stopped being a person living your life and started being a worker performing a job for somebody else. So, the next time you're staring at a clock, waiting for your shift to end, or checking your phone for one more work message before you're finally, technically, off for the night, it's worth remembering that the total number of hours might not be so different from what your ancestors spent tracking food, processing it, and mending tools 10,000 years ago, or 10 times that far back. The hours were never really the strange part of the modern arrangement. What's different, the thing that would have looked genuinely bizarre to almost every human who ever lived before agriculture, is the invisible line running straight through your day, the one that decides which hours belong to you and which ones, for reasons no one really questions anymore, belong to someone else. Their version of that long, effortful day never had a name for itself, never had a boss standing at the end of it checking the clock, and never once made anyone watch the hours pass, wishing they were somewhere else.